So President Cyril Ramaphosa has received the credentials of the new U.S. Ambassador to South Africa. Reuben Brigety II was nominated by President Joe Biden. That was back in February this year to take up this post. Ambassador Brigity's most recent diplomatic assignment was serving as the U.S. representative to the African Union, and he's now live to us in our studios for more on the path that lies ahead. Mr. Ambassador, good morning and welcome to Newzroom Africa.
Good morning.
Great to have you on.
It's an honor to be with you. Thank you for having me.
All right, so what a task that you come from and what a task that lies ahead. But let's first discuss how we got here. The nomination, as I mentioned, from Joe Biden was back in February already. What went into your making the decision to take up the job?
It's very simple. The president asked me to do this. I previously was serving as the vice chancellor of the University of the South in Swanee, Tennessee. And around August of last year, the White House called me and said, the president needs you to go to South Africa. He wants to send somebody that he knows and trusts, who has served in Africa before and who's been an ambassador to Africa before, because he understands the vital importance of this relationship. And when the president asked, you say, yes, sir.
All right. Had you been to South Africa before that?
I've been to South Africa many times before.
Right.
I had previously served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Southern Africa, covering all of our embassies south of the Democratic Republic of Congo, to include South Africa. And then also as a private citizen, I used to sit on the board of the Africa Leadership Academy in Johannesburg, and I have many friends in South Africa, so I've been here many times before.
All right. And it took a while before you had your first Shisanyama, I imagine.
Well,
which took place in Midrand.
I just had one last night.
Yeah.
So I've been in the country sort of 2 weeks, so I think it's not too long of a time.
How was that?
It was great.
Yeah.
I can't do it every day. Then I get too fat, but it was fantastic.
Right on, sir. That's the first diplomatic response. It typically is very much enjoyable, actually. I'll attest to that myself. But on a much more serious note, I mean, diplomacy today arguably is way more important than in our recent history, given what's taking place in the world. And in fact, there are people who are worried that diplomacy, even at a grand scale like at the UN, is losing its significance because of things like the UN's inability seemingly to stop Russia from invading Ukraine. I mean, among many other problems in the world. And what's your response to people who are worried about multilateralism not being as important perhaps as it should be?
Well, I think there are a couple of ways to answer that question. First of all, diplomacy is as vital today as it's ever been. Diplomacy is defined as both nations and peoples engaging with each other in order to try to resolve conflicts and to become much better acquainted with each other. As you say, because the world is so much more complex now, that function could not be more important. As relates specifically to multilateralism, I think two things are true. The first is, what's the alternative? We simply have to find ways in multilateral fora to resolve all manner of very challenging issues that transcend simply the relations between two separate countries, whether that's issues of armed conflict, as we're seeing in Russia and Ukraine right now, or it's issues of climate, or it's issues of economic development. Now, understanding that multilateralism is important, one could also concede that multilateralism has its challenges.
Yeah.
In fact, the continued existence of these sorts of conflicts suggests that we need to rethink and reform how our multilateral structures are actually serving us, or how they can better serve us as we move into the 21st century.
Yeah, and what does bilateral relations, for instance, look like in the context of South Africa's relationship with the U.S., where there are actually really important disagreements around certain things in the world, like what's taking place in Eastern Europe? It's difficult, I guess, from the outside to reconcile how diplomacy continues to exist when countries sometimes approach these important issues in fundamentally different ways.
Well, the fact that we have disagreements doesn't mean that the relationship is not important. I'll give you a very basic example. When my wife and I were first dating, like lots of young people in love, for a good 6 months, it was wonderful and charming, and then we had our first argument. And then we decided to make up, and then we continued dating, and now we've been married for 20 years and have two children, a dog, and a minivan. When we had our first argument and moved past it, that's when I knew we had a relationship. It's also very true in diplomacy, quite frankly. When you are able to understand the differences of an issue and then continue to move through it, you may not see eye to eye, but you understand the relationship is important and that you can come closer together on that particular issue set if you're committed to the relationship itself. That's why President Biden asked me to come here, because he understood the importance of the relationship and wants to continue to grow it going forward.
Would you reckon the disagreements around Ukraine is an obstacle for you whilst you're here?
It's not an obstacle. And I think that, in fact, both Secretary of State Blinken recently had a conversation with Foreign Minister Pandor. I think it's very clear. Both South Africa and the United States want that war to end. I think we have different approaches about how to do that, but we want the war to end. We want Ukraine to be a sovereign state. We want the security guarantees such that that war can never happen again. And the United States, as Secretary Blinken told Foreign Minister Pandor, is prepared for a diplomatic solution today. And we think that there are many ways in which South Africa can contribute to that solution.
Yeah. Part of what also came out of those discussions between Secretary Blinken and Minister Pandor was, around the U.S.'s standing in Africa, as it were. She raised, let's say she flagged, debates around whether or not the conglomerates like the U.S. are in some ways competing for Africa against the likes of China, etc., and being very firm in South Africa's stance that they won't necessarily be on the receiving end of whatever kind of competition is taking place. How do you think that landed?
Very well, because we agree with it. We are not in competition with anybody for engagement in Africa. There is no new scramble for Africa. I think that our country, my government, is certainly becoming more and more aware of the possibilities of Africa as we look towards the middle part of the 21st century, the growing youth population on the continent, the significance of Africa not only for its own sake, but for, frankly, the entire world, and crucially the importance of South Africa as a major voice on the continent and as the only African country in the G20 as a major voice beyond. So we have never asked any African country to choose to partner with the United States over anybody else. We simply offer what we offer, and we understand that African countries, as they should, as sovereign nations, will make their own choices for their future.
Yeah. Diplomacy in Africa post the Trump era, also comes with its own unique challenges, especially when you consider the choice words that Trump had in his own presidency when he described some nations on this continent. Do you reckon, and you've been with the AU before, so you must have been engaged in this kind of work even whilst he was president, do you reckon that made things harder for you guys?
The future is forward. President Biden has made very clear his respect for the peoples of Africa. As he sent me here, I committed to the U.S. Senate and also personally committed to President Ramaphosa that I am dedicated to practicing Ubuntu diplomacy. Diplomacy in a spirit of mutual recognition of our common humanity and our common dignity. And we will practice that in every aspect of our engagement with South Africa. And I suspect that it will also be animating President Biden's and the rest of our country's approach to Africa going forward.
Sure. The future is about looking forward, but another idiom in Africa is around knowing where you come from so that you know where you're going.
Yes.
And this is part of the history that we enter with, at least in this context. And so I imagine there needed to have been some kind of work being done at the very least to clarify where the U.S. stands, despite what the former president had said.
The former president is the former president, and we are clear about where we're going forward.
And where would you say that is?
Well, I think our respective presidents, President Ramaphosa and President Biden, have made clear in the context of South Africa what our bilateral agenda is, focused on 4 areas: health, regional infrastructure, trade and investment, and climate and energy. I would add 2 other things to that. One, I would add, on the basis of our conversations of our respective foreign minister and secretary of state, a continuing conversation on what we call global affairs. So a continual bilateral conversation between South Africa and the United States on global matters beyond our bilateral relationship and even beyond Africa. Because, as I say, we recognize the great importance of South Africa as a global voice. The final thing that I would add in my prerogative as ambassador is the 6th priority is education. I am a 4th-generation educator. My great-grandmother, my grandmother, my mother, and I are all educators. We understand deeply the significance of the power of education that transforms people's lives. We also understand the power of education, the necessity of education in South Africa to ensure that you have a workforce that is prepared to engage in the 21st century, and that it is vital to address the 3 challenges that your president has articulated: the challenge of unemployment, the challenge of poverty, and the challenge of inequality. And I'm very much looking forward to working on that particular sector during my tenure as ambassador.
Yeah, that triple challenge sometimes manifests in significant ways if issues around climate change are not tackled, which is something else you mentioned. The name of the bill itself escapes me, but President Biden just signed a bill recently, or signed an act into law that paves the way in some instances for issues around climate change to be taken a whole lot more seriously. It was a bipartisan matter, and so it's a personal victory for him in some respects as well.
Yes.
Do you get a sense that, South Africa is doing much of the same, taking those kind of issues as seriously, at least from the time you spent in the country already?
Certainly, I think South Africa, as a global leader, recognizes the importance of climate and energy. We have, the G7 has articulated a new proposal called the Just Energy Transition Partnership, or JETP, and South Africa is the first partner in that, committing $8.5 billion amongst the G7 in order to help South Africa transform its energy generation capacity from one based on fossil fuels to more green approaches. We are completely committed to helping to do that. And we look to South Africa as a leader in that space. And in the United States, with regard to the legislation that President Biden just signed yesterday, I believe, it's the most significant climate legislation the United States has ever passed. And I think it's helping to recognize this global moment. As President Macron of France has said, there's no planet B.
Yeah.
So we simply all have to work together to preserve this planet for future generations.
All right. Well, plenty, of course, still in store, I imagine. You had your first Shisanyama yesterday.
Yes.
Have you been able to identify any of your other favorite spots in the country yet?
I'm not going to articulate any favorites yet in true diplomatic fashion, but I will say that I am committed to getting to all 9 provinces by Christmas. And look forward to enjoying many other aspects of this beautiful country.
All right. We look forward to having you around. Thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. Really do appreciate it. The new ambassador to the U.S., the U.S. ambassador to South Africa, I should say. That, of course, is Reuben Brigety II. Thanks very much indeed for your time.